911, what are you reporting?
I got a strange going on out here. Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Damn it, I'm really confused. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence, and he was dead when she hit the ground. I didn't see any cars. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence.
What are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was?
It was standing up. I'm out here looking through the window now and I don't see anything. I don't want to go outside. Jesus Christ, you better...
Sure.
Dia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
Hey guys, and welcome to this week's episode of Sasquatch Odyssey. Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us for the show. It is Friday. I hope you guys have had a great week. We've got an amazing guest lined up for you, but as always, I want to start the show by inviting you. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. You can get me at brian@sasquatchodyssey.net. If you haven't already done so, go over and check out the website. You can become a member there and help support the show. As I said, we've got a great guest lined up for you guys tonight. We have Ken Walker. If you guys haven't already, you have got to go over to Amazon Prime and check out Big Fur. It's a documentary about Ken Walker, who is a taxidermist. Well, he's not just a taxidermist. He is a world-renowned, world champion taxidermist. I know you're probably thinking, well, what the hell are you doing with a taxidermist on the show? But we will paint those dots for you, okay? We will get there. Ken's on to talk about his personal experiences. We're going to talk about the movie Big Fur. Again, you guys have to check it out. At the time I sat down and did the interview with Ken, I hadn't watched the movie. So that kind of comes up in the conversation, which was kind of embarrassing. But nonetheless, I watched it the following day after I interviewed Ken. This interview happened probably about a month ago. But after I watched the documentary, I was like, that was phenomenal. I think you guys will really like it. It's a documentary basically about Ken recreating Patty from the Patterson Gimlin film, which we also talk about tonight a little later on in the interview, because Ken studies animals. That's what he does, right? He's a world-renowned taxidermist, so he's got to know the morphology and the physical makeup of these animals to recreate them. So I wanted to ask him his opinion on the PG film, and we had a pretty good conversation about it. So that comes towards the end. But he's here to share some of his personal encounters. He has had personal encounters, and he's talked to tons of hunters that come into his shop, and they've told him tons of stories about Bigfoot. So he's a fascinating guy. He's a super, super nice guy, very down to earth. We probably talked for 2 hours. I whittled this interview down to about an hour and 15 minutes or so. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. I'm going to stop talking. I'm just going to let the music play. You guys sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. All right, I want to welcome Ken Walker to the show. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. It's actually an honor to have you on the show. I've been super excited. I've heard you on talking about Big Fur and Bigfoot on some of the other shows, and I was like, I've got to get this guy on the show. Some of my listeners are probably saying, well, why do you have a taxidermist on the show? But we're going to get there, so bear with us. For those of you who don't know who Ken Walker is and what you do, sort of take us back to how you got into the taxidermy thing, and let's sort of weave that story into how it morphed into the Bigfoot world. So let's start with what you do and how you got into the taxidermy and go from there.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Well, I got interested in taxidermy like a long time ago. I was probably 12 years old, and I was actually taking books out from the library, but I was kind of a weird kid. I was always, catching bugs and frogs, and I was just intensely interested in anything and everything. And the more mysterious it is, or the more, I was just a very curious kid that really liked to know things and experience things. And I loved nature, and I liked spending time out in the field. And, most taxidermists, it's kind of it's a weird job. You don't find it. It tends to find you. It's kind of a mix of science and art and everything else. And I've always been a bit of an artist at heart, as well as, in the practical world. And it everything just kind of aligned and came together. And I found out that I could actually make a living doing this. And so that's what I did. I literally quit school at 16 years of age and just went right into informal apprenticeships in taxidermy. And so that took me on all kinds of adventures everywhere, through hunting and trapping and fishing. And of course, it evolved into getting some pretty good gigs as a taxidermist as I became more experienced. And then I started competing in the competition world for taxidermists. And I ended up winning the world championships and the best of show. I think I was the first non-American to win best of show in 1999. And then the next year I won the Nationals best of show. And, things kind of snowballed from there. I became more known in the taxidermy world. And I tend to have credibility there. And then along the way, I was always interested in Sasquatch and Bigfoot stories as a kid. And then, as I got older, I decided that, obviously, if somebody hasn't brought one into my shop and let me skin it, there's no such thing, right? But then I just started running into too many clients that swore they had encountered them. And so that was when I decided to investigate for myself, and then I got into that aspect of it, and my credibility actually carried me a long way, because people thought, well, if he's looking into this, because I know the guy's not crazy, even though they do think I'm crazy. I kind of got into a position where people would at least listen to me and trust me, like with their encounters and their stories. So that kind of happened. And then when Dan Wayne decided to do the Big Fur movie, I didn't realize he was making a feature-length movie. He just called me up and says, can I make a show about you? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So it was going to be about taxidermy. And then when he found out that I was actually interested in the Sasquatch mystery, and that I was also planning on using the Patterson film to create an accurate model of what was in that film, his movie kind of changed and evolved into something what he considered a little more eccentric. So that's kind of how that came about. And so, over the years as a taxidermist, I've had so many hunters come through here, and I've kind of made it my mission to investigate anything that could actually throw evidence up. Like hunter shootings of Sasquatches. I'm known for investigating those. And yeah, this just kind of snowballed, and it's garnered a little bit of attention since the Big Fur movie come out. So it's just kind of evolved into this. Me sitting here getting to talk to you and all your wonderful listeners.
It's fascinating how things sort of intertwine, and I love the fact that you talked about the credibility with what you were doing in the taxidermy and people trusting you with their stories. I found doing this show, it takes a lot of trust for people to come forward and talk on a show like this to a person like me. Some of these people, I don't get to meet them. I just talk to them on the phone, and we're doing these interviews long distance. And the show, as it's evolved and gone on, I think people listen to the show and they listen to my style and the way that I interact with people. And I have a background in law enforcement. I was in law enforcement for 16 years. So I tend to take a little bit of a different approach, that cop mentality to everything that I talk to people. And I'm pretty skeptical when it comes to cryptids in general and Bigfoot and those kind of things. So I take a skeptical mindset when I'm talking to people, but the credibility is key because a lot of people's encounters are very traumatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and for them to trust you to share that encounter. I mean, there's still people that I've had interviews with off the air that they can't get through the entire story. I've talked to them multiple times, and I'll get 3, 5, 6 minutes in, and I don't get the entire story because they just say, I can't talk about it.
I've encountered that a number of times as well.
Yeah. And it sort of lends credibility, in my opinion, to what they've experienced because, you hear a show like mine and some of the other encounter shows and you think all these people are just attention whores. They want to come on and get their 5 minutes of fame or whatever. And that's not really the case at all. And I'm sure there's a few of those that squeak by. I've talked about that on past shows. I know there are people out there who probably embellish their stories somewhat. I don't ever want to have anybody on the show that I don't believe has had some sort of a genuine encounter, right? But I'm sure they squeak by. But in general, the people that I talk to, it takes hours and hours of conversations outside the show to get them to come on and share their story. Without the credibility, right? Like you've established in your field, and as a podcaster, I don't know how much credibility you can have as a podcaster, but if there's credibility to be had, I guess after a while people sort of believe that, and that's a very important thing. So let's talk about some of the stories. I want to get to your personal encounters, of course, but let's talk about some of the stories that you've collected over the years from some of the hunters and the people that you've interacted with in your daily business.
Well, there's one interesting story I can tell you about. It's actually a guy who lives in the town of Alberta Beach here. I've known him for years. He's a guide and an outfitter, and he's kind of an interesting guy. He was, I think, 14 years old, and this is quite a few years ago. He was north of an area called Fawcett Lake, and also that ties into the Pembina River system here and the Martin Hills of Slave Lake, and then those are all areas that historically have encounters. The native communities still experience encounters in that area, and there was one that actually made the airwaves here a couple of years ago of a guy bear hunting who ran into a Sasquatch in that same area and had it. When he ran out, it threw a giant lump of mud onto the front of the truck his family was sitting in. And but anyways, my friend was he'd found footprints, and he told his uncle, he says, I found footprints that looked like a giant man. His uncle told him that it was a bear, had to be a bear, that he was mistaken, that there's no such thing as giant man footprints out in the forest. And so the next day he was out, and he had a .308 Norma Magnum, and it was one of those old hunting situations, back in the old moose hunting days when everybody had a moose license, and they give you a gun and you had a box of shells. You didn't know what was in it. You had a collection of shells from different years and things like that. And you're in close, and you figure, you get a shot at a moose or something. It really wasn't like it is now, where everybody's making sure their ammunition is 100% perfect and everything. So he was walking along, and he came around a corner, and there was a berry patch in front of him, and he said on the ground in front of him on this berry patch, he said, was the world's biggest black bear. And so he lined up on it and he shot it with this .308 Norma Magnum. And he says the thing leaped up to its hind feet and put both hands on the exit wound and started to scream. And he said the thing was huge, like 9-10 feet tall. And he says it started jumping around, and it looked right at him, and he said its eyes were bloodshot, and it really, like he said, it was not right with it for a long time, and it ran away. So he ran and got his uncle, told him, he says he shot a monster. So his uncle came back, and he looked at the tracks, looked at the blood, and grabbed him. He says he put him in the truck, never said a word to him. He said left the camp standing, everything. Didn't say a word, and left there. Left everything behind, and never spoke about it, and just took him out. Like you said, he left his favorite frying pan back at the camp. And he said that to this day, I don't know if he's still alive, but it sounds like he is. He said that he refuses to speak about it if anybody else is present, but he'll acknowledge it if nobody else but my friend is there. And he was always, pretty upset that he never got to follow up on this thing that he shot at. Then he was hunting on the river in the Brazos Flats, or the Blackstone Flats on the Brazos River, which is quite well known for Sasquatch sightings here, some years later. And they were, I forget what they were shooting at. He said he emptied his gun, and he says as soon as he started to unload his gun, he says the Sasquatch broke cover and ran across the flat. And he said that thing knew his gun was empty and that he was reloading it. He said it was smart enough to know when to run. And he said, because there's people out there that if they get a chance, they'll shoot one. I'm not one of those people, but he is. Sorry to say it, they're out there. But I told him, I said, look, I have other shooting stories, and you don't want to follow these things if they're wounded. They're never alone, and I says you're just unless you have a plan and you're able to move one immediately. I said I wouldn't take the chance because you're going to end up with a whole world of trouble if a bunch of other ones show up, which happened to another friend of mine. Yeah, that's one of the shooting stories. Another one from just up the road here, there was a man named George Kelly, and he's deceased now, and his brother was out. It was either berry picking or cone picking. Now they pick up the pine cones, and then they take them to these facilities where they heat them up and they get the seeds out so they can reseed these forests, and they get paid by the pound or by the bushel of these pine cones. And everybody who does that has a gun for protection from bears. And he had his kids with him. He turned around and he said there was a Sasquatch standing with his kids. And he got totally freaked out and he shot it. And it ran away. And it was George's son that told me. He's an outfitter now too. And he said that his dad tracked it for 2 days and never found it. Well, then I was talking to another guy who knew George very, very well. And I related the story to him, and he kind of smiled at me and he said, well, I know that story. George told me himself. And he said, so his son said he never found it. And he said, no, he said, that's not how it ended. And I looked at him and I said, you don't even have to tell me. It led them into a blind canyon where they were set upon by a bunch more. And George always claimed that they almost never made it out of there. So that's a very interesting story. Now, you have to remember, these people that I'm talking about aren't acquaintances. These are people that have a ton of credibility and people I've known for many, many years. Probably if I didn't know them, I wouldn't have got the stories or the accounts out of them, And there's so many of those in the hunting community like this that it would astound you. And for some reason or another, people just feel comfortable talking to me about this particular subject.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the credibility, like you said. It goes a long way with people feeling comfortable enough with somebody who's attained the status that you've attained in your business and your craft. Mm-hmm. And then, you're dealing with hunters, and it's not easy to get hunters and cops, frankly. I've had a hard time getting both to come on the show because they're having these kind of experiences, but hunters and cops they're just not the talking kind when it comes to things like Bigfoot. So it takes a special person and a special relationship, I think, to drag those stories out of people, like you said.
I think so. Well, I've told people, I says, really, if you're doing, Sasquatch investigations, I says, there's two types of people out there. One, the type of people that really want to see one, and there's also the type of people that wish they never had. And it's the latter that you want to talk to. Whenever, these people that basically didn't believe it would be like first person to make fun of somebody else until they see one, and then they just shut up when they do. They're the best witnesses you can have because it's something that just sits so ill with them that they have nothing to gain by telling it, and they're not trying to embellish a story in such a way because they really want to see one. They wish they'd never seen the darn things because now when they're out in the woods, they basically know the things are there. And like they say, they don't sleep the same at night. They don't look at the trees in the same way. Every little sound catches their attention. And, the people I know that are aware of them in the forest say that the forest changes majorly once they know that these creatures are present.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. It's that feeling, and I've experienced that. I've never seen one, but I had an experience when I was like 12 years old when I was hunting. And I believe I was paced out of the woods by a Sasquatch with the vocalizations I heard and the huffing and the bluff charging. I just don't know what else it could have been.
Very likely. If a bear bluff charges you, you'll see it. They tend to bluff charge with a sight line. Sasquatch bluff charges you, you almost never see it. You almost never.
Yeah, that was the thing that confused me the most. Is it felt like it was just going to bust through the canopy at any time, and it just never did. And then I got the hell out of there, But that feeling that I had before anything happened, and during and even after it happened, that hair on the back of your neck, just indescribable fear that I've never experienced before or after. And I've been in some hairy situations. I've been shot at on the streets and, all kinds of things in my career in law enforcement. And none of those things scared me the way that encounter did. And even some of the vocalizations we've heard on our property here in North Carolina, there's just that hair on the back of your neck stands up and it's like, holy shit, what was that? And there's no explanation for it,
Yeah, and I've had people the same way. They describe the fear as unreasonable. It's an unreasonable fear. Like, I don't normally get that afraid. I'm like some of these people that I know are scared of literally nothing. As a matter of fact, they're scary people themselves. And they said that the fear that they experienced was off the charts. And I got zapped once. They call it zapped, I guess. It happened to me once when I was going into an area where we'd found their nests along the road. Like, they watched people come in and out. And the only way I could describe the feeling that I was experiencing was being awake for a nightmare. You know that awful feeling you have when you have a nightmare, that almost blind panic. And only I was wide awake. Sometimes you wake up from a nightmare and after about 5 minutes you think that was silly. Well, it's not the same thing. In this case, 2 hours later, it still isn't silly.
Yeah. What do you think that is? I've talked to so many people that have so many different experiences, and some of them are the more woo type out there experiences. And I've talked to Steve Coles, for example. I talked to Steve today about something totally unrelated, but I've had him on the show, and he's very straightforward with his beliefs and, flesh and blood kind of thing. And he's told me in the past he thinks infrasound may have something to do with some of the more woo type disoriented feelings that people tend to experience when they come in contact with these things. Do you think?
Well, there's a reasonable explanation. There actually is. And this is, you might want to call it a theory. I've kind of proven it. And I don't think, infrasound is interesting. You have, a lot of animals that exhibit infrasound, but usually they evolve to such a thing. Whales and, underwater animals especially, infrasound is very important. But you don't have a lot of terrestrial animals that basically deal in infrasound. But one thing that all animals use, including humans, to a much lesser extent, is electromagnetic energy. And I actually started studying that particular phenomena when I was hunting. And there's a thing you can buy called a HECS suit, HECS, which is the Human Energy Concealment System. You can Google them online, and I bought these HECS suits, and I use them for hunting. I have animals walk up to me, and unless they can't smell me, and they can see me clearly, but they don't actually believe they're seeing me. And including coyotes, which are smart, and what it does is it's a Faraday cage made of carbon filaments that's in this cloth, in the HECS suit, that hides your electromagnetic signature. Now, it's pretty well known that wolf packs communicate silently. When wolf packs are worrying a moose, for example, they'll all sit down and two will worry it, and then when the wolves are tired out, they'll sit down and two more will get up, and those two know which ones have to get up. Then they basically rest in shifts until they tire the moose out so badly that it can't fight back, and then they pull it down and eat it. I mean, we've seen wolves laying on a cut line here, all stand up at the same time, all turn right, and all walk at the same time. You're talking 12, 13 wolves. And, dogs are people consider them to be empathic. If you have a dog, it knows when you're feeling bad, it comes over, it knows if you're scared, it just reads you. And if somebody comes into your yard that's up to no good, the dog reads them immediately. And so I believe dogs, they're higher functioning when it comes to electromagnetic energy. Now, I think the Sasquatch has taken that same ability that's inherent in all animals, or it's basically, shared by all animals, and has developed it literally to the extent that we have with sound, and that they're able to not only read it, they're able to emit it. And a lot of this stuff that I'm, discovering through talking to people kind of adds itself to it. And one of the things that is key in that theory is the way that dogs behave in the presence of a Sasquatch. Like, they will literally turn inside out. Like, they can be completely disarmed and completely freaked out. That, like, they won't track one, and they'll hide, they'll shiver. I called one in on the Alberta habituation here when Dan travels with a dog named Betty, and she was laying by the fire, and we were in an area where the trapper told me that they gather this time of year. It was a cold night. We were drinking wine by the campfire, and I said, let me give a couple quick calls. And I says, your dog will tell us if there's one around here, if my theory is right. And I said, does your dog ever, shake and shiver or pee itself or, and he said, never. And I said, first of all, I have no magical, mystical powers over your dog. You understand that? And he says, yeah. So I gave 2 quick whoop calls, just really fast. Because I find that if you call, they know it's you. But if you call really quick, they kind of think they heard it. And then if you shut up, they'll actually come check you out. Because moose are the same way. If you overcall, they know you're a person. So I gave a couple of quick calls, and the dog never even lifted his head when I called. It just lay curled up sleeping. About 10 minutes later, that dog leaped to its feet and ran over to Dan and was fixed on the ridge downwind and was trying to bark. He was so scared. It was peeing down his legs. It was shaking uncontrollably, and it was fixed on that ridge. And Dan's eyes got as big as saucers, and I was just laughing. I said, there's one on the ridge. Because it's downwind. He's going to come in downwind because they smell so bad, And I told him, I said, and it's probably leaving. It knows it's busted. I said, your dog will probably be fine in about 5 minutes. And which came true. That the dog, after about 5 minutes, calmed right down, but never left us, stayed like right at our feet. And I think that was a pretty good indicator of the fact that they can manipulate these electromagnetic fields, probably scanning you. We don't realize it, but the dog does. I've witnessed people have their memories erased, part of their memory, and I've heard stories like that. I've heard people being put to sleep. And there's also something else that I found really interesting, and that is that there's a lot of people that talk about Sasquatch emitting a red light from their eyes. Now, when I say emitting a red light, with no outside light reflection source, that all of a sudden their eyes will glow red. And I've talked to people who've seen their eyes shine that says it's just a normal blue-green, If you think about it, if they can generate an electrical field and they could actually illuminate something inside their eyes, it would shine red because of the blood in the eyes, just like the eye shine from a human in a photograph. So I find this interesting. Like, it's, this is all theory and stuff, but they're all just kind of observations that I've made. And an electric eel is only just, a small fish, but it can create an electrical charge enough to kill a man on a horse and kill the horse too. So imagine if electric eel weighed, 1,500 pounds and had that ability, how much electricity could it generate? We just don't know, but it just seems plausible. I find that it's more plausible in the infrasound theory, just because all animals seem to have this ability to, read electromagnetic fields in the wild.
That's a very interesting theory. And, I don't exclude anything on my show. I talk to people about UFOs. I've had a UFO encounter in my life, so I don't exclude the woo on my show. But,
No.
I've had Ron Moorhead on the show. We talked about some of the things he experienced up at the Sierra camp. And it just defies logic. You got 4, 5, 6 guys that are hearing their camp being destroyed from inside their makeshift shelter, and then they go out and there's nothing there. It's like a mass hallucination, sort of auditory hallucination. Yep. And Les Stroud has talked about what he believes is mind speak during a encounter with Sasquatch. And Les is supposed to come on the show towards the end of the year, and I can't wait to have that conversation with him because I'm fascinated by that, and I don't know what to make of it. I don't doubt his experiences no more than I doubt Ron Moorhead's experiences. I believe that they've had those experiences. I just don't know what to make of it.
Well, what I found with these witnesses is that they'll tell you what they can rationalize, and there's a lot of times there's things that they can't rationalize that they're not telling you, and they usually won't tell you. But if you develop a relationship, and then you can it takes a while to ask the question, is there anything weird that happened that you just are discounting or that you just don't want to tell me about? And I'll say the reason being is I'm getting these stories, and I don't discount anything. I listen to it. It's like you say, the electromagnetic theory is really, if you watch the videos on the Hex website, I mean, these guys are hunting turkeys with bow and arrow. And they will walk right up to an eastern turkey, right up to it, 5 feet away, and shoot it with an arrow.
Wow.
Now, I've hunted turkeys down in Florida, and I tried taking a step towards one at 500 yards, and that thing was gone. It's just like it was across a big clearing, and it was way over there, and I thought, I'm going to try and stalk it. I took a couple steps, it was gone. But they say but birds are very subject to electromagnetic energy because they use it to migrate, from the poles. And that's why they go north, that's why they go south. And so it makes a lot of sense that birds would be, very sensitive to electromagnetic energy because, like the people who were testing the suit said, they walk by trees and bushes constantly. And yet, if you're standing anywhere within 100 yards, they know you're there. So, but they don't even look at a tree or a bush. So what they did is they used equipment to get their electromagnetic signature down to nothing but a bush. And the darn bird treats them like they're a bush rather than a person or another animal. And so if you watch those videos, and I've had the same experiences using the Hex suits up here, because if you want to shoot a 190-inch whitetail, you better wear one. I've gotten 3 that size, and they know you're there. But that's why I wear the. I don't let them pattern me, and I wear the Hex suit. But I also, since I got zapped that one time, I never go looking for Sasquatch without the Hex suit on either. I don't ever want to repeat that performance when I got that feeling out there.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've talked to people that have had that sort of zapped experience, and it can be disorienting and pretty scary because you sort of lose control of your faculties and you're sort of scramble brained for a while, and that's not a good combination when you're out in the middle of the woods for sure.
Yeah, luckily I knew what it was because I had experience with talking to people about it and also through research. So I was acutely aware of what was happening. And I figured it's got to be close. I cussed it out, I wasn't very happy. I cussed it out. I said, don't do that to me. I'm not in here to shoot you.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, like I said, I wear the Hex suit now that if I figure if it stops electromagnetic energy from going out, it'll stop it from coming in. I don't know. It's really hard to say. My dog will bark at me if I come out of the house in a Hex suit. He won't do it if I'm not wearing it, but he'll be afraid of me if I wear the Hex suit. He can't read me. So it's very interesting, that aspect of it. And of course, the use of the Hex suit in the hunting community is treated almost like the Sasquatch phenomena, in that there's a lot of people that think it's a bunch of woo-woo themselves, just wearing the suits for hunting. And I tell them, I said, well, fine, don't wear one. I said, but if I used to put hunters in bear bait stands all the time, and I says, the bear always knows you're there, always. Look right at you before they tear a beaver carcass from the tree. I said, unless you're wearing that darn suit. My son and I went to northern Saskatchewan, and they said usually about 8 bears show up at that bait. Well, 16 of them showed up. They were climbing the trees we were in and everything. And I still think that was because we were wearing those suits.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to look into those. That's the first I've ever heard of that. So I'm going to definitely take a look and watch some of the videos. I think that's fascinating.
It is. It's very fascinating, and that's one of the reasons why I have it kind of as a pet theory because it makes sense. Really everything can be explained. Even there's all kinds of paranormal phenomena and things like that, and I firmly believe there are paranormal events because I've experienced those. I've experienced a near-death experience. That thousands of other people have experienced the exact same thing that I experienced. So I know there's a lot more that is beyond our comprehension. During the near-death experience, I remember knowing everything. When I was going up into that light, I remember actually knowing everything. There was nothing I had no questions because I knew everything. I just got back here and I couldn't remember what I knew. So I know that there's things like that, and just from my own experience, I also know that experience, you can't have a shared hallucination with thousands of other people who've experienced near death. So I'm open. I'm always open to hear things. Like there's a lot of things I don't buy. Like everybody thinks that I don't put pins in maps, in my shop, because I know if I started doing that, there'd be a whole bunch of these jokers around here coming in here trying to get me to put a pin in a map, someplace. So I don't buy into everything, but I'm usually a pretty good judge of whether somebody's telling me the truth or not. I've had people say to me, well, you have to admit that 90% of the accounts can't be real. And I said, where did you come up with that number? Well, I said, that's because you believe that only 10% could possibly be real. I said, you have no basis or grounds to make that statement other than to pacify your own belief. And I said, I'll tell you what I've experienced. I've experienced what I think of the people, especially in the hunting community, that come to me, about 99% of what they're telling me is accurate. Because it's just, you just know, like somebody comes in here, they don't want attention. I've had best friends stand here and one guy tell me a story and the other guy turn around and just stare at him, not having ever heard the story from their best friend of not just encountering a Sasquatch, but seeing one up close and personal. So I tend to find the vast majority of accounts to be accurate. And they don't vary. Everybody sees and smells and hears the same thing. It's not like one guy's seeing a unicorn, the next one's seeing a mermaid, and then that guy's seeing a dragon. That's what hallucinations do for me. They're all seeing something that is either black or if it's brown, it's got a reddish tinge to it. It stands about between 6.5 to 10 feet tall. Arms are long, big black eyes, nose up high, close to the eyes. Just the whole thing. It's just the point on the head. I had one friend who shot one it died on the ground in front of him, and he said it had a head like a football, had a pointed chin and a point on the top of the head, and it was a female, and it actually tried to kill him. And I know this guy really well. This isn't a story. I'm still actually investigating aspects of it, but and these people, like they come out of it traumatized because that one guy told me that what he had on the ground in front of him was not an animal; it was a type of man, just not a human man. And a lot of the shooting stories, people will actually abandon what they've shot because once they realize, they actually feel like they shot a person, and so they cut their losses and they leave. Like everybody says, well, why didn't you buck the thing up and put it into your quad trailer and bring it out? Well, I know a lot of hunters, but I don't know a hunter that could actually take a human and buck him up with a chainsaw. Unless there's something serious. Well, you're in law enforcement, there's something to be seriously wrong with them, right? Most of the people that have these encounters don't describe what they encountered as an animal, but as a type of man.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you bring up. And I've done shows in the past. I did a members only show a while back it was a pretty famous case. I think it was on Coast to Coast years and years and years back. I think the guy, he said he and a couple of friends of his back in the 70s shot and killed two Sasquatch, a male and a female. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that he kept going back to. And I listened to the audio and I did the research when I was putting the show together. And I believe that this guy is telling the truth. And that was
the guy in Texas, right?
This was actually, I believe it was Texas, actually. Yes.
Yeah, I've heard that audio, and I believe it too.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I can't remember his name. It's going to drive me crazy. But he kept going back to, I thought that we were going to go to jail for murder because I thought we had killed, these things looked too human. And that was one of my questions I was going to ask you is, A, do you think these things have been shot and killed? And clearly you do because you've investigated these. But why no body? That's always the skeptical go-to question, right? And I've asked that question too. I asked that question of Jeff Meldrum, about the population. And if we're having thousands of sightings every year and they're across the country, literally around the world on almost every continent, some variation of these things are seen. Why have we not had a body at this point?
I'd like to talk to Jeff sometime because one of the experience he had out on the Alberta habituation actually ties into one of my shooting stories. He doesn't know that. I'd like to talk to him.
Really?
Yeah. And what happened was what has happened, at least in the one story that I have that I'm still working with, is that a lot of other ones showed up and they carried the bodies off, and they actually buried them above ground. It was wintertime. They buried them above ground, and that's one of the reasons why I'm still working with this. They actually gifted the gravesite as well, but unfortunately, people aren't very forthcoming when it comes to taking me somewhere where I could possibly collect evidence, just because of the trauma. And, not wanting anything to do with what has happened. So there's a few, I have a few open-ended stories that, with shootings and evidence that I work with. And I should also tell you that, if you saw the Bigfoot movie, you saw that I had some actual scat samples from a Bigfoot nest. And the last of my samples have gone to some different labs here in the last year, and we're preparing to get some results from the analysis of those.
Well, I would love to hear about the analysis and what you get back. That'd be a great time to have you back on the show once you get that information back.
Well, I had them analyzed by the Fish and Wildlife because I do work for the Fish and Wildlife here. And I knew they had a foothills enforcement, and so he took a sample from me, and they were actually doing grizzly bear counts by DNAing scat samples. These were collected in the winter, like they were frozen within minutes of being dropped, and they were never thawed, so they were pristine samples. And so it took a year, and finally I talked to the guy. I said, did you guys ever test that? And he kind of looked at me funny and says, "Oh, didn't I ever tell you that?" And I said, "No." And I think he wasn't supposed to tell me what they found, but he told me they were inconclusive. And I didn't, at the time, I was really new to anything DNA. I didn't know what they were talking about. I thought inconclusive meant they didn't find DNA. So I told him, I said, "Oh, I was kind of hoping you'd find DNA." And he says, "Well, that's not what I said." He said, "This is actually the result you wanted," is what he told me. He said that it doesn't match anything in GenBank. And they're inconclusive, and he says they wanted me to find out as much information about where they were collected and the circumstances that I could get from you. And I said, "Are they willing to put into writing that it could be what I say they are?" He said, "No," emphatically, "no." And I said, "Well, when they're ready to do that," I said, "tell them I'd love to talk to them." And he looked at me straight in the eye and says, "I don't blame you." Now, his whole thing changed on that day. As a matter of fact, he went into early retirement very shortly after that. And he came by with a couple of antelope a few years later. And of course, he's not in an official capacity. He's retired. And he looked at me and he said something that really resonated. And he said, I watch the news for you every day. He says, "I know I'm going to see you on the news one day." And he smiled. And I kind of got what he was telling me.
Yeah, I talk to a lot of people who believe there's a little bit more government cover-up involvement in the Bigfoot community. And I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist at heart. I've always been that way. But it's just like the UFO disclosure thing that's supposed to be happening and things are coming down. And
Yep.
I talked to people on the show. I just did the show last week was an abduction. It was a UFO abduction story from a guy that has had several abductions that he told us about on the show. And he believes that the government works with aliens and these things. And I tend to believe, although I was a low-level street cop, basically, in the city of Atlanta, I still worked with a government agency for 16 years of my life. And people would be very surprised how little the government actually knows about anything, and this widespread, government cover up of Bigfoot. I just don't think it exists. I think on some level locally within maybe offices and, the DNR and those kind of things, sure, they probably know more than they're allowed to say. And they don't talk about things. And I've heard about places where sightings occur and things happen and then they show up the next day or 2 days later and they're clear cut, right? So I know that stuff happens, but I mean, what's your opinion on that? Do you think the government is covering these things up purposely?
Well, when somebody comes up to me and says that there's no way they can be there because we'd know by now, I agree with them 100%. I agree with them 100%. If they exist, and they do, they know about them, plain and simple, because they can't not know about them. There's too many people with a lot more resources than you and me that would need to know, and you can go all the way back to the 30s on that one. They have to know something if they exist. Like all of the years that they have been denying that UFOs exist, it is now clear that they knew they did. It's now clear. And so, for whatever reason, they've kept it, they kept it classified. And one of the most interesting things I ever found online, and it wasn't there for very long, but some kid was doing research. He was going through archives, and he found a letter that was given to one of the American members of the expedition that Sir Edmund Hillary had to find the Yeti. And he was under instructions on who to contact and what to do if they found any proof. And this was a letter that just in some archives, he found it, and he published it up. I should have copied it. I do that now, but I didn't do it back then. And it was in a pretty official letter, and it says that we need to get ahead of it, any evidence that's found, and we need to make sure that we can cancel the evidence and keep it classified, just like we've done with the North American Sasquatch. It said right in the letter that person that was put onto that expedition with Sir Edmund Hillary to find the Yeti was planted. And that particular letter vanished real quickly. I've also seen, military guys that came on and talked about operations they had, and people were asking this one guy questions, and they said he knows all the right people. He was at that, I was in that same camp. He was there. He knows the commanding officers. This guy's legit. Then all of a sudden, boom, gone. Everything just sanitized, just, gone. I've seen that sort of thing a lot. A lot of stories about, evidence, and also too, whenever something comes out in the media that looks really good, and I'll give you a really good example, is the Squamish, British Columbia film of the Sasquatch walking down the snow valley and then turning to the left and going straight up the mountain. I hunt bighorn sheep in the mountain. What that thing on two legs did is absolutely impossible in wet snow. You cannot cover that much ground in 2 minutes and 43 seconds, which is what the duration of the video is. Now, when it came out on the news, it kind of went viral, and it came out on the news here. A couple weeks later, a guy came onto the news, onto the national news, and he didn't look like he was in shape, and he had a little hat on and a hiking stick, and he said, "Oh no, that was me." And he says, if you look at the date on July the 10th or whatever, he says, "Here's my little logbook. I was in that valley," and they ran a news story on the national news about how this yo-yo was the guy that was actually walking there. What was really great about that story is they went and talked to the guy who actually took the video, and it turns out he was a wildlife biologist who took the video. And he says, "Nice try, guys." He said, "I uploaded it on the 12th, or whatever date that guy corroborated." He said, I took the video on July the 1st. The man wasn't there. And he says, second of all, he said, what I filmed was not a man, and nor was it a bear. He says, if I haven't seen 1,000 bears, I've seen hundreds and hundreds. He said, what I videotaped that day, I have never seen before or since. And I'm a wildlife biologist. I know what I'm looking at. And I didn't recognize anything that I had seen before when that thing walked down the valley. So the question, and then a lot of people started arguing, saying, well, if this guy came forward, it was obviously him because people want to doubt it. And I said, so I tell people, I said, I want to be on the national news tonight. What do I got to do? I said, can you get on the national news? I said, how on earth did this yo-yo get on the national news with his little story? I says, no, think real carefully. I says, you just don't get on the national news. Somebody has to put you there. I said, the fact that this guy's trying to create reasonable doubt tells me that film is 100% successful. And I've seen, whenever I see a real effort to cause doubt in a piece of evidence or film, whenever I see like over-the-top effort, I believe that film is probably real. Because there is a measured response against evidence, a measured response. And like that biologist, when I saw him talking, I believed what he said. When I saw the guy that said he was the hiker, I could tell by looking at the guy that he could not walk up that mountain without stopping. He wasn't in shape. I was some of the best sheep hunters in Alberta. And even, like one of them I showed that video to, mind you, he knows Sasquatch are real, but he looked at it and he laughed. He said, well, I don't know who that guy is walking up the mountain. He said, but I'd love to have him pack a sheep out for me. And, if you're in law enforcement, a good investigator doesn't look necessarily for what's there, but he looks for what's not there. And what wasn't there was how this guy got to be on the national news and nobody else does, Why was he all of a sudden on the news able to, cause doubt in this story when nobody else really could? I mean, it's just some guy phoned up and they said, yeah, we'll put you on the 11 o'clock news in Canada. It doesn't, like that itself didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I guess that certainly makes sense. And I guess, I've been wrong before. I think there might be some concerted effort, on some level to disparage people who come forward with evidence and, like you said, cause the doubt. And if nothing else, just plant that seed of, doubt or whatever on whatever evidence is presented.
Well, I can tell you something that happened to me lately is when I was when I was actually lining up with these labs to get the rest of the samples to them, on Facebook, on my personal page, I had an album of photographs called Sasquatch Stuff. And it was tree structures and tracks and things. And, I didn't really add a lot to it. I just had it on there for people that might look me up who want to see what I'm doing, what I have to say about it. I went on there one day and that album was gone. Like it was taken right out of my Facebook. And so I went through my banks of photographs and everything was gone. Like all of the photos, I have them on my iPhotos, so it doesn't matter, but they were gone from my Facebook page. And there was no explanation. There was no nothing. They were just gone. And so I put a post up about it. I said, my Sasquatch stuff vanished. And then a guy in Whitecourt who was on my friends list started basically messaging me the photographs. And so I thought, well, what's going on? So I messaged him right back and said, where did you find these? He said, I had them in my mobile uploads. And he said, so I decided to send them back to you. He said, every one vanished from my device when I sent it. He said, as soon as I sent it, it was gone. And I said, you're kidding me. And I didn't know who this guy was. I friend a lot of hunters and stuff, And he said, well, I had an encounter between Whitecourt and Fox Creek, and I've been too scared to tell you about it, but I encountered one. And that's why I watch your page. And I thought, well, that was weird. And I thought, well, if they want to erase the stuff, I don't care. I'm not going to, I made a post that the stuff was gone. But then I had to pay a bill suddenly here in the shop. So I had to phone this automated phone robot thing, that I had to, and basically they confirmed, they said, are you calling from, and then it gives my number, 780-924. Anyways, 3 times in a row, it gave a number that was not mine. And I literally couldn't get through to pay the bill because I could not confirm that number as mine. And it wasn't mine. It wasn't a number that I knew. But apparently that's where I was phoning him from. So, and I knew right then and there. And the other time I had a friend of mine from New York, Paulo. He gave me a call, and I could tell it said New York on the phone. It's always him. So I picked up the phone. I put my headset on, the same phone I'm on right now, and I clicked the talk button. And as soon as I clicked the talk button, I heard a man in a voice that I didn't recognize say, "Ken Walker speaking." And I said, "Hello," and Paulo said, Hey, buddy, what? I said, "Did you hear something?" I said, "Did you just say something?" He said, "I heard something. I don't know, but I didn't say nothing." I said, "Did you hear somebody say Ken Walker speaking as like they were putting a header on a tape?" And he says, "Well, I heard somebody, and that, I mean, I'm not a paranoid guy. Like, I don't care. I mean, if they want to sit and listen to my conversations, I might tell some off-colored jokes, but I don't know. It sounds like it'd be a boring job to me." I could tell you one thing, I will never discuss evidence over the phone. I talk about things that, but if I'm working on things, or if I even had evidence, I wouldn't talk about it on the phone, so I don't know why. But yet I found that obviously there were other people talking about getting these samples from me, and then all of a sudden it seemed like they were listening to me. Now you have to also understand that this is my business line, and getting a warrant to talk from a law enforcement point of view, to talk on a private line is very difficult. It's as easy as making an application for a business line. It's very, very easy. Now, I know this because, my son's in law enforcement. I know a lot of people in law enforcement. I got great Sasquatch stories from law enforcement people, So I know this, but I mean, I really don't feel like I talk about anything on my phone that's going to get me into trouble. So I don't really care if they want to listen to me. It's just that, I sure wish I should like to know why they're keeping all of this stuff quiet.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question for sure. And I know I started this off by saying I wanted to talk about your personal encounters, and we're like an hour in and we haven't talked about your personal encounters. So would you mind sort of sharing your own personal encounter stories and telling us what experiences you've had with Sasquatch?
Well, sure. And the funny thing about knowing about whether Sasquatch are out in the woods or not is you end up doing a retrospective look at everything that's happened over the years and trying to put pieces of things that you couldn't explain together. So 30-some years ago, or probably more, I was driving down a road called the Simpson Timber Road out of Blue Ridge, Alberta, which is west of here. And I was south of an area called Kidney Lake. And we would drive up and down this road because they seeded the fresh clover. And it was in the spring. We were looking for bears. And, of course, we were kids. You'd get really excited. And I had my buddy with me. And I yelled, "Bear." I saw a bear come busting out of the trees. And it leaped across the ditch and onto the road. And I went, "No, that's a man." He was all dressed in black from head to toe. And he just flew across the other ditch. And then he ran up a hill. And it was a pretty good hill. Like they seed the clover in those hillsides because the root structure keeps them from eroding until all of the natural sedges can take hold. And that's why, and the bears eat it like candy. And this thing ran up that hill without slowing down. Now, even a bear doesn't do that. A bear runs uphill, it slows down. This thing didn't. It had momentum like I've never seen before. And it was, for all means and sakes, it was a man, because it couldn't have been anything else. Only a man runs on two legs like that. But I've never seen a man, first of all, that scared at 400 yards, and I've never seen a man run that fast. Now, if you've ever seen the Memorial Day footage where that one runs across the mountainside, that is precisely what I saw. And it hit the trees like at maximum warp speed. I mean, this thing just hit the trees. And I said, well, it has to be a cut line right there, a seismic line. So we drove up there, and my buddy that was with me said, "Was that a Sasquatch?" And I told him, straight up, I said, "There's no such thing. It had to be a man." I said, "But dressed in head to toe in black like that, he's going to get shot." And so when I got there, like, our bush is pretty thick up here. There was no trail, there was no cut line, no nothing. And I never thought to get out and look at tracks because I just assumed it was a man. So I thought, well, I'll find his vehicle parked, down the road. I drove 20 miles. There was nobody parked on that road. And back in those days, there were no side roads there either. It was just that road. And it never sat right with me. It was something I never forgot because something was just not right. And all these years later, it makes far more sense that I saw a Sasquatch than I saw a man, because of the speed, because of the situation. Not to mention the fact that the loggers still see Sasquatches on the road at night coming out of the logging area south of Kidney Lake. That area has history. I've gone in there, I found old tree structures, but they are tree structures. And I don't find them everywhere. I only find them in places of activity. It was Adrian Erickson that told me just north of Kidney Lake. He said there's Sasquatch on the Freeman River. He said, I know they're there. He hunted that area too. And then, of course, there's a highway that goes between Swan Hills and Fort Assiniboine, north of the Freeman, where people see them. There's an incredible amount of deer at night on that highway, and a lot of people have seen Sasquatch actually trying to catch deer at night on that highway. So that area has activity, it has history, and everything kind of lined up. So I would say that is the one sure time that I could say that I very likely saw one. I would say the chance is 93% that it was a Sasquatch, not a man. Going back that far, it's really hard to say. I got hit with a rock once. Something hit me with a rock years ago. I picked the rock up and put it in my pocket. And I just couldn't understand if a squirrel would carry a rock up a tree, and what are the odds in the middle of nowhere of that rock landing on me. I was trying to work my way through anything that I believed it could have been. The last thing that I thought at the time was that there was a great big monster chuckling to himself 30 feet away behind a tree. But that I believe is the case. That was in Tom Hill Tower. Also got a lot of witnesses from hunters up there, witness accounts. So there's that. And when I've been investigating on the trap line, where my friend told me they all live, I've had them circle upwind of me, and I've caught the smell of them on a number of occasions. And, one was gagging, it was so bad. And the other ones are like wet, skunky dog. It's a pretty distinct and strong odor, but the one smelled like rotten dead grass and feces and vomit. It was, and the trapper told me after I told him that I had that experience there, he said they do that to me all the time. He says they try to freak you out. He says they want to see how you'll react. So I've had that experience as well.
Yeah, I've heard the different accounts in the past where I've talked to people about the smell, and that's always sort of fascinated me. I don't get that in a lot of encounters. Rarely do I ever, maybe 10 to 15%. But when I hear people talk about the smell, it's always that same sort of reaction. It's like I could barely keep down my breakfast or whatever because it was so pungent. So I've always thought that was interesting.
Well, Adrian Erickson told me that the big males are the ones that smell real bad. And he said that he encountered a female with a young one once, and she smelled like wet, skunky dog. He described that other smell. And he said, but and gorillas will give off a gagging odor too, But I mean, so will a bum that hasn't showered in 3 years.
This is very true. I've had a couple of those in the back of my police cruiser heading to the jail in the past. So.
as nice as not a nice thing to say, but the facts are facts, right?
That's the truth. That's the truth.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I've walked behind people at the airport that did not smell good at all. You could tell that they've obviously missed a few flights, and so the Sasquatch, like the real bad one that I smelled, it had that aspect of BO to it. Like I could tell it was a biological smell, and the wind took it away. I had turned around after trying to get up a trail into an area where the trapper told me that I would always find footprints if I went there. And I couldn't get up there with my quad. He says, it's too dangerous. I darn near flipped the thing in the middle of nowhere. They probably wouldn't have found my bones. So I came back down the trail and went up and then turned around and came back. When I hit the crossroads, something had walked out and was watching me. And it ran behind a tree or ran away, but the smell lingered long enough for me to get that gagging odor, and then the breeze took it away. And once I realized that happened, that was when all the hair went up on the back of my neck, because I realized that whatever I smelt was moving, and it was very likely watching me. It was actually the last time I went in there alone. I don't go in there alone anymore. If I have to go in there now after those encounters, I take somebody with me.
Can't say that I blame you there. I think that's a smart move. Before we close out, I want to switch gears just a little bit, and I want to talk about something that's sort of been on my mind this past week or so. And it sort of goes back to what you were doing for the film, Big Fur. You were sort of recreating Patty, basically, from the Patterson Gimlin film. And I know with your anatomical knowledge of creatures in your business, right? That's your business. You have to be able to have that ability to take a look at evidence, basically, and recreate something based on muscular structure and bones and those kind of things. And I know you've looked
especially joint position, like where the joints are, which leads to ratios, bone length. So I had to see on the Patterson subject where the pivot points were on its knee, on its ankle, on its thigh, on its elbow, on its shoulder. That was very important that I charted that stuff out.
Yeah, and I certainly I've talked to Jeff Meldrum about, who's looked at that film extensively. I haven't talked to Bill Munns, but I know I've looked at some of the things he's done and his extensive knowledge of the breakdown of that film. And he probably has more, I know he has more evidence squirreled away with all these scans, these 4K scans he's done of the Patterson Gimlin film. And he's looked at this over and over. But I don't know, the last week or two, there's been some talk about Bob Gimlin supposedly come out and said that the film is not what it appears to be. And that's one of the reasons I talked to Steve Coles today before I got on the phone with you. I had Steve on to sort of clear the air, and because
I've been reading that stuff too.
Yeah. Well, I had Steve on today, and I actually invited Russell Accord. I reached out to Russell a couple of days ago and gave him and Bob the opportunity to come on the show and talk about it. I guess I've always struggled with the PG film, and I think I've been back and forth so many times, but after talking to Jeff Meldrum and him just emphatically saying he believes that is a real live Sasquatch in the film, and the Bill Munns, analysis of the film, and then listening to you on other shows talk about it.
Listen, if somebody wants to debunk that film, they're going to have to tell me how they did a number of things. And this is actually, I came to the same conclusions that Bill Munns did. He spent a lot more time. I read his report after I had done my stuff because I wanted to be unbiased. But whatever's in that film has bone length ratios that are outside of human parameters. Now, I want to know how they were able to find a subject to wear a costume whose shin is that short. Their foot is that long. Because the foot is long, the shin is shorter than the femur, which is the opposite of a human. They're the same length. In a human, that's why you have that heel strike and that lower angle. But because the shin is shorter and it walks with a compliant gait, meaning that the knees are always bent, because you can't walk stiff-legged if you weigh 1,100 pounds. You just can't do it. You'll break your legs. You have to be able to absorb the shock, and then also you have to be able to control your momentum. So when that animal, and when Patty draws her leg forward, her shin is parallel to the ground because her foot is long, her shin is shorter, and her knees are bent. So she has to draw her leg forward and then level the foot out and then place the foot down in front of the other leg and then do the same thing. You can't walk like that without looking like a Lipizan stallion if you have human parameters. So if somebody is going to tell me that was a suit, they're going to have to show me the ratios of the bones of the person who wore the suit, and they're also and how did they get their arms 30% longer yet had their elbows in the right place, and also how did they? I want to see the foot, when you see the bottom of the foot when in the photograph, the stills, and the stills are a lot clearer than people realize, because I used the Know the Sasquatch book stills. You can see all 5 toes, and you can also see the indentation on the outside of the foot, which is what I usually use to confirm if a track is real or not. I want to see the foot that they used in that costume. I want to see that foot, that's in there. They're going to have to prove to me that they faked it, not just hearsay, because that's whatever the problem with everything is, hearsay. They have to prove to me that they faked it, and they're gonna have to show me the parameters of the person who wore the suit, and why they could fool me, because I built stuff for the Smithsonian Institute from photographs, and I also Yeah, I want to see the suit. I want to see the craftsmanship. They should be very, very proud of themselves. And you think people would brag about that. But, don't just tell me it's a fake, because I have people tell me that all the time. Prove to me it's a fake. I want proof.
Yeah, I'm the same way, man. I did a show recently for the members about the Hoax of the Century film that Greg Lyon, the documentary with Greg Lyon, the investigative reporter. And the entire film was nothing but hearsay, conjecture, and just filled with this. He had an agenda, right? He was clearly
That's right.
trying to assassinate the character of Roger Patterson. And, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what somebody's character is. It's the same thing when I was investigating crimes as a police officer. I would show up, and maybe I had dealt with somebody in the past and their history was what it was, and they had this rap sheet a mile long, and then they're reporting something, and I have to take that into consideration maybe, but I can't take the character of the person and let that dictate the evidence, because the evidence in of itself is the film.
Well, look at the whole the mainstream is shifting to actually trying and convicting people in the court of public opinion without due process. And it's become fashionable, and that's why this is happening right now. The thing that you're talking about. People see, you can assassinate somebody's character and cancel them and destroy them without any evidence or without going to court or without due process. And so now you're seeing it in this Bigfoot world. They're just doing what has become fashionable, and that is trying to destroy somebody's reputation or anything by simply using hearsay, and because it's on the internet, it's got to be true. The whole thing makes me sick. Listen, if you've got proof, if you can prove to me that what I have concluded from that film is wrong, then prove it to me. Okay? Because I have seen plenty of hoaxes, and I can spot them within seconds. And that film is not one of them. Not even remotely.
Well, that definitely helps me come down on, I've always leaned towards, and I wanted to believe that the film was real. And that's one of the things Steve and I talked about earlier today, is I've always wanted it to be real. And, if it's not, even if it were proven that it's a hoax, it doesn't in of itself mean that Bigfoot doesn't exist. And I think a lot of people are sort of hanging their hats on the whole idea of Bigfoot seems to revolve around the PGF. Yet I think actually the Patterson Gimlin film more revolves around the Bigfoot community. So
yeah, I agree. But I mean, if you just go by the arm ratio in that film, you look at any hoax, the human arms are far, far shorter. Oh, and here's the other thing that I want you to remember. This is probably one of the best indicators that it's real. And if you look at the arms hang straight down on Patty, you see that they hang straight down. They hang straight down, and they're outside the hips. Now we know from measurements, my charts, John Green's charts, that she was 28 inches wide at the hip. Okay, so you can kind of just make a circle with your hands on how big her shoulder muscles with all the muscle must be, because I've got a tape measure. There's 28 inches. My hips are 15 inches wide. Okay, so this is 28 inches, and that's big. Okay, and those arms hang straight down. So you're talking the center of the shoulder joints at least 36 inches apart. Now, when I built the model, I came up with this. Whenever you see somebody in a bulky suit, their arms always stick out at an angle because there's no way to cut your spine and move your shoulder joints 36 inches apart. Go into a gym, find the biggest guy you can find. Go to the center of one of his shoulder joints to the other, and tell me if you can find somebody that's 36 inches from center to center. You ain't going to find them. Doesn't exist. Okay? And that's how big she had to be for her arms to hang straight down. There's another one. When I built that model, it was phenomenal how wide she was. I just couldn't get over it, so anybody who spent any time actually rationally looking at the size ratios in that on that creature, like, there's just no way. Now, I should tell you what I did for my size chart. in one of the photographs, you can see Patty's foot is like her shin is parallel to the ground. You see the bottom of the foot. You see the 5 toes, the pad on the foot. Well, they casted the tracks that day. They're just under 15 inches long. So what I did is I made a measuring tool from the frames, and all the frames are the same size, and that's how I measured from joint to joint. I used that 15-inch, and then I extrapolated measurements. Okay, so I used basically the length of the footprint to get my widths and everything else. Then I made a chart, and then I compared it to John Green's chart, and it was identical down to the inch. And he did his chart by measuring the trees and the things on site. Okay, so I made my chart a way that I trusted, and he made his chart the way he trusted, and we came to the exact same conclusion. That tells me that both our charts were very, very accurate.
Well, that's one of the reasons I asked the question, because I knew you had done your homework, and I knew that you would tell me one way or the other the information that might help me form a better hypothesis. And I like I said, I've come down after the conversation again with Steve today, and you, of course, and Dr. Meldrum in the past. I believe that the film is legitimate, and I believe that's a real creature.
Yeah, and also, I think it was Doug Hadjusek interviewed me the other day, and he asked me a question, and it was funny that I had never been asked it before, but he asked me why the Sasquatch walks in a straight line, like a tightrope. You know, I think there's 3 inches of deviation on a Sasquatch trackway, and there's 6 inches of deviation on a human trackway. And I figured it out right away as soon as I saw the Patterson footage. And what it is that the animal is so heavy. It's a lot heavier than people think because it has far more muscle mass than, say, a bear. You know, and a bear that size would weigh, 700 pounds. She's almost double that. I'm sure of it, and I've talked to my hunting friends about it, and we've all come to the conclusion that these Sasquatch are far heavier than people realize. And because of that, there's energy to be expended when they move. And the only way that you can keep that momentum going smoothly is if you keep your center of balance. You have to keep your feet under your weight. You can't move from side to side. So the only way they can carry that balance or that weight forward with momentum is by putting one foot straight in front of the other and then fluidly moving over top of that. You know, they can't bounce from side to side. They have to walk in a straight line, in a straight momentum line, in order to conserve energy and to, less wear and tear on a physique that is that heavy.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense if you think about it.
And I mean the way, and then you talk to people who've seen one, and they say that they move so smoothly. Well, that's because they're carrying incredible momentum. That they have to conserve energy like any other animal, so they're going to walk in a way that basically, they got their feet under the weight, under the momentum. And that's why they tend to, people say they glide when they walk, because they're too heavy to move from side to side without causing stress and momentum problems. So like for somebody who studies motion in animals, it makes total sense to me. You can see it in an elephant when they walk. You can see how they control that sheer weight and momentum. And I get that from the Patterson film.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, man. And I think that your knowledge, training, and experience, and certainly if it doesn't qualify you as an expert, you're certainly more qualified than most to talk about some of those things about the PG film. So I certainly appreciate you sharing that, man. I've had a fantastic time talking to you. I'm so glad you came on the show, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And that's it for tonight's show, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you guys next week.